Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. Amid the Doklam standoff, a trade war appears to be looming between India and China after New Delhi earlier this month imposed anti-dumping duties on 93 Chinese products, according to Chinese newspaper The Global Times, urging the Chinese companies to think twice about the risks involved before making investments in India. The news report warned India to be prepared to face the consequences for its ill-considered action. The report also said that China could easily retaliate by putting restrictions on imports from India, but it doesn't make much economic sense for the country. It said if India really starts a trade war with China, of course China's economic interests will be hurt, but there will also be consequences for India. Quoting statistics from China's Ministry of Commerce, the article said that in the first half of 2017, India has initiated 12 probes into Chinese products. The Global Times also cited figures from the Indian embassy in China to show that Indian exports fell by 12.3% year-on-year to $11.75 billion, while India's imports from China rose by 2% to $59 billion, resulting in a trade deficit of $47 billion. On this edition of Policy Watch, we will take stock of the trade issues between India and China. Joining me on the program today are Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, T.K. Arun, Editor, Opinion, The Economic Times, and Ajay Srivastava, Joint DG, Foreign Trade, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Policy Watch. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you. Is there a trade war looming between India and China, taking off from what's happening on the border in Sikkim?
Well, I'm not sure what the connection with the border, but certainly there have been concerns voiced in India about imports from China. You go today to the wholesale market, and practically 80-90% of the toys and household utensils and stuff like that that you get in Sadar Bazaar will probably be of Chinese origin. And there have been voices about the concerns. The second thing is that we should also ask ourselves, what have we done wrong? For instance, we've allowed the rupee to appreciate against the yuan. Now that will make Chinese imports cheaper in India. So on the one hand, we complain about the dumping by China. On the other hand, we ourselves are not doing enough to keep the exchange rate at a competitive level. So I'd say that, yes, there is a possibility, but I'd be very surprised if it gets out of hand. Okay. Because the Chinese imports that we depend on, outside all this toy stuff, are very important. The stuff, the power equipment that we get, for instance, or the stuff we are getting for our solar energy program, 87% comes from China. 30% of our power equipment over the 12th plan came from China. More than half the mobile phones sold in this country are from Chinese models. So I'd say that considering the fact that these are important parts of the economy in India, I'm not sure that we will see a large-scale trade war. We will have some hot words exchange, but I doubt if it will go beyond that.
You know, T.K. Arun, what are the sectors that India can do away with as far as Chinese goods are concerned? Are we completely dependent on them, or can we stay without these Chinese goods, like Mr. Desai just pointed out?
See, I actually have very little sympathy with this worrying over a trade deficit with China. What matters for a country is its overall trade and current account deficit, that balance. Now, the Chinese have a huge surplus vis-a-vis us. The Chinese import, China imports huge amounts of stuff from many of India's export markets, from many African countries, which are primarily commodity exporters. Purchasing power and prosperity there depend on their ability to export things to China. And they export that, and they create purchasing power, which in turn they use to import from a range of countries, including from India. We should be happy. After all, what matters for us is our overall balance of payments, which today is perfectly fine. So why are we so bothered about the direct deficit with China? I wouldn't worry too much about this. And there is a good reason if you are importing power equipment and solar panels and mobile handsets and mobile equipment, and phone, telecom equipment from China. They are coming at the most competitive prices. And having these things available to us as the most competitive prices helps us an economy, helps our people. So why would we sabotage that? There are some things where policy restricts exports from India. Some phytosanitary conditions can be deployed to say, we will not take your mangoes, we will not take your vegetables and things like that. But these are things at the margins. Yes, we have a problem. There is a global oversupply of steel coming from China. So around the world, countries have taken defensive measures against steel exports from China. So has India. Similarly, on some other sectors where the Chinese are giving a vent for their domestic overcapacity in export markets, countries do take up defensive mechanisms. And since India has not recognized China as a market economy, it's easier for us to do this than for many other countries.
Sure. I'd like to bring Ajay Srivastava into the picture now. There are these calls by several trade unions and even the general public about how India should boycott Chinese goods, really. Is that really an option, or can we just dismiss some of those calls that are being made by some of the trade unions and others?
Yeah, I don't agree with those calls, but my take is like this. I don't worry about the imports from the China, but I worry about the critical dependence on China for imports. For example, more than 70% of our imports of mobile phones, switches, other telecom equipments, even bulk drugs, they come from India. Now consider the critical dependence on bulk drug, what it will do to our pharma sector. Our pharma is a success story. And when you say more than 70% of the inputs for your exports are coming from Chinese, I am a worried person. 10 years back, this dependence was less than 10%. We had many bulk drug manufacturers, but over the past 10 years, because of whatever reasons, one of the reasons could be Chinese subsidies or maybe our inefficiencies, but the imports have increased. We should not be critically dependent. And why I am saying is this: in the past 4 years, China is supplying us both the intermediate goods and also the consumer goods. They are reducing the exports to India of the intermediate goods, which means they don't want to focus on bulk drugs in future. They want to go to the end of the value chain, which means they want to compete with us in the pharma sector. I am worried about that. Similarly, on the electronics products, more than 70% is too much. Japan imports 85% of their mobile phones from China, but I am not worried about Japan. Why? Japan also exports to China back the components which go into the making of iPhone or other smartphones, mobile phones. We don't export back. So the two-way trade, which happens through global value chains, is simply non-existent for electronic sector for India. So I worry about these things. I worry about something more also.
Yeah.
On the export side, if you look at the data for 2003 to 6, Comtrade WTO data, our exports are more than what we are importing from China. But something happened in 2005. What was happening? So our exports were about $10 billion in 2005. Now also our exports are 2005. Chinese exports to India were $10 billion in 2005. Now they are $60 billion. So the large deficit, how it has happened, we have to think about this. I don't think enough thinking has gone to this. My take is this. It's very commonsensical and simple. We are middle level suppliers of good quality medicines and small cars, diamonds. We supply to demanding markets like US, European Union, Japan. Everybody accepts this after checking all the qualities. China imports all these things, diamonds, small cars, medicines, globally. They will not take it from India.
Sure.
So quality cannot be an issue. When Japan is accepting, Korea is accepting, US is accepting, there is something else. So what we found out is that China applies non-tariff barriers. Now we have to understand this very clearly as a country. There are two types of barriers. Tariff barriers, I raise the duties and I say duties are high, so your product will cost high, you cannot export. But these are visible, you have to report to the WTO. Non-tariff barriers, they are invisible animals. Even a country, suppose they apply on Indian exporters, my country need not be informed. So an exporter is trying to export to China and China rejects it. How they do it, it's very interesting to know. Say, there are 3-4 instruments. Many countries use this, not only China, I must be honest here. So these instruments are, I say Chinese inspectors will come and inspect your factory. The results can never come.
Sure.
Indian government need not be informed. Then there is certification. My basmati rice requires 13 certifications. The results are to be announced by a Chinese lab. Indian labs or European lab is not good enough.
Sure.
There is no appeal. These things are there. They can be done in a very subtle way. What's the end result? Wherever we were standing in 2005, we stand there only.
Sure. Okay.
So we need to take a strong lesson
yeah,
from
we
this.
need to take a strong lesson and strong steps too need to be taken. How do we address this issue of trade deficit, Mr. Desai, because it stands at close to $50 billion in favor of China at the moment?
But as far as trade deficit, every country in the world can't be in trade surplus,
Sure.
This has to even out. And the point which Arun made, for us, what should matter is the totality. And he made a very, very rational point, which is that China is importing stuff from people, creating incomes there, who are in turn demanding Indian services and goods. There is a difference. They are a manufacturing powerhouse. We are a services powerhouse. We are not importing services from China at all. But
Sure.
we are basically importing manufactured goods. That difference has cropped up over the past couple of decades. That China is the manufacturing powerhouse. We are the services, certain services powerhouse. So I would not look at the deficit as something which is a problem. The problem could be if the underlying policy factors are discriminatory. When he talks of non-tariff barriers, that's discriminatory. Then you can say that, yes, we have to address this. You cannot have non-tariff barriers specifically directed against us. I would say that there are issues of national security, which also we may wish to take into account. Certain items of equipment will be sensitive, etc., etc. He mentioned the whole question of the precursor chemicals for pharmaceuticals, which come mostly from China right now. And I would say that this is an area where we have to ask ourselves, why is it that though you have such a flourishing pharmaceutical industry, you haven't built up an industry on precursor chemicals? Let us look at our policies. On what is it in our policies which is leading to people getting this stuff from there?
Sure.
So I'd say that I don't see the deficit in itself as a problem. Only address those things which are distortions. Second, don't just think in terms of retaliatory action. What is the point of a boycott? Boycotts are used for political purposes. A boycott is not a rational trade instrument. You use a boycott when you use it in the freedom struggle or something, you see. But that's a different story.
Sure.
So I'd say that this talk of boycott is absolutely, should be off the table. We must look at discriminatory policies, address them, argue with them on that. If necessary, retaliate. If they are going to put in non-tariff barriers, we'll put in some also. This called in trade policy is called the Poitiers solution.
Sure.
I won't take time to explain that, but it's a well-known thing that people use these things. So let's say we can retaliate with isolated things. It has to be done subtly. You can't just do this with this hangama saying boycott Chinese goods, this, that. Just focus on a few things where it will hurt them and say, you guys are doing this, we'll do this.
Okay.
So watch out.
Sure. So what should our key focus areas be then, TK Arun? I mean, what are the sectors that we focus on really if we want to send out a message to the Chinese?
See, we have to strengthen domestic manufacturing capacity. I see no reason, as Mr. Srivastav said, why the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs that go into manufacturing formulations should come from China. Why we cannot produce them more efficiently and cost effectively in India? We should do it. Similarly, in the case of basic telecom network equipment, there is all said and done, there is a security issue. So the fact that Indian companies haven't done the investment in research and technology, research and development to enable us to be producing this kind of critical equipment domestically is an issue. Now, the benefit that India derives from being connected, by being digital, by putting a phone in virtually everyone's hand is immense. So that cannot be forsaken in the name of balancing trade with China. So, but what should be done is to encourage domestic R&D and domestic manufacturing. So unless one does that, you will perpetually have this kind of a weakness in areas where that economy has a competitive edge, which is manufacturing. They will beat the hell out of us, and they will keep on having a trade surplus.
Yeah, they'll keep flooding the Indian market as well, and there's nothing that we can do about it.
We can, firstly, it is good since we are getting these things at a cheap price.
Right.
Secondly, to prevent over-dependence, which can prove a source of vulnerability, we should strengthen our own domestic manufacturing. And that is something India can perfectly do, because given the kind of talent we have, resources we have in terms of man and material, this is something we should be able to do. What is lacking is actually, one, the political will to crystallize this kind of industries and this kind of investment in R&D. Second, we have only 0.9% of GDP in R&D, whereas China has more than 2%,
Yeah.
Korea spends 4%, the US spends around 2% of a huge $18 billion economy. So we need to spend more on R&D, both the government and the private sector, instead of thinking that we can always buy technology off the shelf from Western sources. That's
Sure.
not possible.
Sure.
So that industrial policy and more daring, bold, entrepreneurial imagination on the part of Indian industry, which will allow them to do things like, hiring 25,000 engineers and putting them into R&D in developing a particular area of, say, telecom or drugs,
Sure.
or nanotechnology or whatever. That is what is lacking.
Right. Mr. Srivastava, you spoke about critical dependence as far as India on Chinese goods are concerned, as well as critical sectors. There was a report in the media last week about how India is probably reviewing that as far as the power sector is concerned. Chinese investment in critical sectors is being reviewed by the Indian government. Is that a good thing?
So I say we need a 3-step program to handle the situation. One, we already announced that we need to increase the share of manufacturing to 25% of the GDP. So we can work in that direction. So 92% of India's imports from China, they come in only 3 sectors: electronics, engineering and chemical. So we have identified about 30 products from these 3 sectors. We say a very strong Make in India initiative on these 30 product groups should be taken. If any subsidy is there, all the countries they do this, we should also take it on very priority basis. Number 2, on the day-to-day use item, I'm not very comfortable when we use Chinese umbrella or Chinese crockery or Chinese furniture, but 90%, 95% of these products of our imports, they come from China. So there should be design studios to help our innovative SMEs. Not everyone can handle this, but design studios, we must invest in at least 100 design studios. Germany has a very strong program on design studios. They have very active collaboration program between academia, research and industry, and their SMEs, they are one of the most efficient globally. We have to follow that. That model is called Mittelstand model of Germany. We must take something from there. Number 3 is we must understand what the world is doing. So what the world is doing, China is not alone in imposing NTBs. US is doing, as the duties are coming down because of WTO, most of the countries, they are using these hidden barriers. We have not used it sufficiently. We don't have expertise. We must develop that expertise very fast. We have been talking for long about developing standards, about developing our testing facilities, laboratories. We must set up. Government has taken many steps in this direction, but I think big urgency is needed in setting up a perfect testing, certification and standards regime for India. These 3 things will, I don't say will counter Chinese import, we don't need to counter, but they will make us a strong manufacturing nation. That's needed.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, it's that time of the program now where I get closing comments from all my guests. So we'll look forward and what the way forward really is. Mr. Desai, how?
The way forward is first for us to look at our domestic policies and in what way these domestic policies have prevented the type of backward integration that we would have needed. In what way have they prevented us being able to be ready with non-tariff barriers to counter other people's non-tariff barriers because we haven't had the testing facilities and so on. What will happen tomorrow if you tell the Chinese, look, every boiler imported into India will have to be inspected by Indian engineers before you ship it. We could do it, but we don't have the capacity to do it. But why would you want to do it? I would in the first instance, leave the capital goods side to one side, because it's something where we are gaining. If we get something 10% cheaper, our investment is 10% less. Second, on the security argument, which is a valid one, why only China? You think you're safe if you get the stuff from America or from somebody else? They are capable of putting the same things inside those things to keep track or whatever you are afraid of. So be careful in any sensitive area when you are getting stuff from abroad, not just from China, but from anywhere.
From anywhere, yes.
So I'd say that don't get paranoid about this. Really ask yourself, why is it, and is China the only country where you have this issue? Is this the only country where you have this problem that you have got similar problems in many other places?
Yes.
For instance, NTBs and so on. So take a much more coherent view. Your trade system, your current account is in reasonable shape. You can afford to take a few chances. Go ahead and do it.
Sure. You know, TK Arun, Mr. Srivastava was talking about how he doesn't like people using umbrellas from China, doesn't like to see that. He says, why don't we do it here and, you know, adopt a model where we can actually do that here in India. But the problem with something like that is the fact that it's not going to be cost effective. The reason why we see so much of goods in the Indian market from China is the fact that it is cheap and it is easily available to all of us at that price.
Yeah, better.
Okay, and they're better is what Mr. Desai is saying as well. So is that a model that can be replicated here, and can we see a success story as far as that model is concerned?
See, let us face it. China today, as far as labor costs are concerned, is a relatively high cost economy as compared to India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Vietnam. So there is ground to hope that some manufacturing can flourish in India, which will substitute the imports from China. We are doing some things right. We have got the GST in place. We are open many more banks, which will hopefully start lending on more easy terms to our SMEs. Our SMEs today actually get very little credit from the formal banking system. They have to rely on high cost finance from informal sources. So that is changing. So these are all positive things. They had to set up expensive power generation, diesel power generation units to run their plants. Now increasingly, if we get our power sector policies right, we have the capacity to supply power to them from the grid, which case they will be more efficient and lower cost. So the potential to upgrade our domestic production is so high that I wouldn't rule this possibility out of actually substituting a whole lot of Chinese imports with local Indian output. So that is one possibility. On strategic sectors where a national security thing is involved, there is no getting around from the need to step up our R&D. And if necessary, the government should set up a public sector unit to create the kind of critical telecom network equipment that we require. This dogma that the government should never be into business is all meaningless. There are some sectors that are strategic for the country in terms of long-term economic gain and from the point of view of national security. If a domestic capacity doesn't exist and doesn't seem to be coming forth from the private sector, then the government should set up the unit. Later
Sure.
you can privatize. So no sector is permanently strategic.
Right.
At some point steel was, now steel has ceased to be, but telecom equipment, satellites, these kind of things are strategic, and
Right.
the government should be there.
Sure.
Right now there is a big vacuum in the policy and the political will to make good this deficit in creating the domestic technical and R&D capability.
All right. Ajay Srivastava, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Sure. I would like to respond to the truth behind the Global Times story. See, they say the trade war is looming. India has moved. The story came on August 13th.
Yes.
India has moved on August 9 for imposing anti-dumping duty on 93 products. So what's the truth? Truth is simple like this. On August 9th, the same day, we responded to a Parliament Rajya Sabha question on this, and the response was that India imposes anti-dumping duty on 93 products from China. These duties are in force for years together. While the impression was created that we are going to impose on a single day, we took a decision. So it was totally wrong. You know, even in such trade wars, we have to get our facts right. Here,
Right.
facts were distorted. We can distort the interpretation, but facts were distorted. So I think it's totally discredited story. My worry was that most of the Indian newspapers, they followed up with that story. They repeated without doing any research on that. So it was totally baseless story.
So they followed blindly, and that was the
Yes.
mistake that was made. Facts should have been checked, and then the story should have been put out, is
Sure.
what you're saying. Okay. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of Policy Watch. I'd like to thank Nitin Desai, TK Arun, and Ajay Srivastava for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.